Hello viewers, welcome to this educational platform Study China with MDY. Thank you all for joining this conversation on India-China border tussle, explaining domestic dynamics. There have been much commonalities between India and China. Both are ancient and older civilizations that carry the scars of past imperial conquests. Both are rapidly renovating and recapturing their status as global trading and economic powerhouses. And they are the two most populated nations, collectively home to over one-third of the world's population. Yet, despite these commonalities, India and China have been unable to resolve their shared boundary. This simmering tension, which continues to exist along the Himalayas, has been described as both puzzling and a paradox. The border between India and China is not clearly demarcated throughout. Along certain stretches of its 3,488 kilometer length, there is no mutually agreed line of actual control. India, following independence, believed it had inherited firm boundaries from the British. But this was contrary to China's view. China felt the British had left behind a disputed legacy on the boundary between the two newly formed republics. So India-China border is divided into three sectors: Western, Middle, and Eastern. The two countries are also engaged in confidence-building measures on the border with bilateral agreements signed in 1993, 96, 2005, 12, and 13. By the beginning of 21st century, the two sides had agreed not to let the border dispute affect bilateral engagements or cooperation. Despite 2 decades of CBMs and the thaw in bilateral relations, incidents on the border known as incursions, intrusions, transgressions, or violations continue to be reported. Despite informal summits like Wuhan Summit or Chennai Connect, the current tussle near the Galwan area being the most recent example of long-standing problem between the two Asian giants. So, to discuss issues related to the current tussle, we have a special guest for today's conversation. So let me first begin by welcoming and introducing Professor Raviprasad Narayanan, who teaches at the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. He has been China watcher for many years. Professor Narayanan also spent 7 long years at the Institute of International Relations, National Chengchi University, Taiwan. So he's a person who has a very nuanced understanding about China, its domestic politics and governance style. So let me begin with Professor Raviprasad. We have already heard and read much about the borderline and current activities. Amongst many aspects, including current state of affairs, along with the line of actual control, the nitty-gritty on the ground, bilateral economic relations, and regional and global politics, I would expect you, Professor, to have a quick rundown on the domestic fronts of both India and China. And it would be great if you could talk about the domestic elements factoring in this dispute between India and China. So you have roughly some 15 to 20 minutes to speak about. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much, Yasin. I'll try my best to answer your question. Now, the thing is, this current issue with this Galvan Valley, that has come as a surprise to many in our country. But to those who have been watching Sino-Indian relations, this was bound to happen for the simple reason that ever since China had a domestic change in 2012 with Xi Jinping at the helm, he has been trying to assert his authority within the Communist Party of China. Before he assumed the mantle of being the General Secretary of the party, he did face some friction from established honchos within the party, which tells us that for very many decades, the Communist Party of China has been dominated not only by a personality at the helm, but also factions. To go back a little in history, in 1949, the People's Republic of China, it came into being after a brutal civil war with the Kuomintang, who relocated in double quotes to Taiwan. Mao Zedong was the prima donna of that time, but his overwhelming personality and the traits he brought into the Communist Party of China did not go well with others who had fought more against the KMT and felt that the Communist Party of China, the CPC, should not be dominated by one individual because the party is much larger than a personality. First issue of conflict within the party emerged in 1959 when 3 years of the Great Leap Forward started in 1956, which led to the death of millions. It was discussed within the party, and at a plenum, it was argued by one particular personality, and who said that the party is larger than personality politics. And Mao at that time decided that the party may remove him from whatever power he has, and hence he felt that he needs to take a retreat. Retreat those days meant a political retreat. When he went on a retreat, the party was then effectively run by Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. And these two people, they tried to correct the anomalies that had come up with a Great Leap Forward, with several forward-thinking scholars in China those days saying that the Great Leap Forward was actually ended up becoming a Great Leap Backward. Now, beyond that, Mao was plotting his time so that he could get even with people in the party who he thought are going to sideline him. And those days, politics was simple. Those who were sidelined either had to spend long time in jail, long time means an entire life in jail, or they're hung or shot. So Mao didn't want to go through that particular episode. So he plotted his return, and that was when they were having a domestic political crisis. There was a plenum held in Hangzhou where Mao, he somehow reached the podium and he gave a talk saying that the party should be ashamed that Dalai Lama had left China and Tibet is China's, and he escaped into India, and India has given him shelter. So the Tibet crisis has been since then. And he felt that the PLA has to make amends to the slips that took place, allowing His Holiness Dalai Lama to come into India through Arunachal, which many in Tibet still claim is a part of Tibet, to complicate politics of this particular part of Asia. Now, since then, Dalai Lama in China has been called Dalai because it is supposedly a socialist state. It is. But so hence, there is no religious activity which is legal. So you had this domestic emphasis which was determining certain external aspects of China's foreign policy. What I'm trying to say is China's domestic politics have played a very important role in their external adventurism. Mao then comes back in 1965, and to cement his power within the party, he encouraged his then wife, Jiang Qing, to start the Cultural Revolution, which started in 1966, went on till 1969 at its peak. It went on till 1976, actually. Now, with India having been taught a lesson, losing the war in 1962, which hemorrhages our decision-making to date. During the Cultural Revolution, domestic politics in China, because a personality wanted to imprint himself further within the party, in 1967, there was several episodes like what we are facing with China, which the Chinese had with the then Soviet Union, especially the Musuli River, which otherwise people call the Ussuri River. And also in that part of China, which we know as Xinjiang, and which before 1949 was called East Turkestan. Now, which meant that domestic crisis in China has led to conflictual situations where a full-scale war is not declared, but something which is less than a war happens. History repeats itself. We have read about it. We know about it. 1979, by the time Deng Xiaoping, who had been imprisoned, then he was released after the death of Mao by Hua Guofeng, who was temporarily in charge and whose claim to legitimacy was that he carried a chit which said, "With you in charge, I am at ease." It seems that chit was written by Mao. Now, Deng Xiaoping then galvanized people in the party to be the next leader, which he became because the party wanted somebody of his stature, because he had fought during the Civil War. He had suffered a lot. His family also suffered. He was imprisoned. And he became the general secretary of the party. And he decided that the 4 modernizations, which effectively was announced, actually it was announced by Zhou Enlai way back in the 1960s, that was revived and reintroduced, and he won a majority in the party to introduce economic reforms. This led to a very powerful faction within the Communist Party of China to feel stressed. This powerful faction is the PLA. The PLA felt that if the reforms in economic terms succeed, then they would be made redundant. Why? Because many people in India do not know that the People's Liberation Army is the army of the Communist Party of China. In India, on the other side, the Indian army swears by the constitution. But in China, they swear by the Communist Party of China's constitution. Now, in 1979, domestic affairs where Deng Xiaoping had succeeded in introducing economic reforms, but at the cost of the PLA feeling upset, they felt they will be cut out of the success or failure of the 4 modernizations and the open door policy. And there was a manufactured war with Vietnam, where not surprisingly, the PLA ended up on the loser's end, because the Vietnamese were used to war for several decades. And the Vietnamese had a simple policy of arming all the citizens, especially northern Vietnam, so that warfare is done in every village, every homestead. The Chinese perhaps missed that aspect, and they actually walked into an ambush once they did not inform the Vietnamese that they have reservations. Whatever reservations, we don't know. It has to do with land, I'm sure. Now, to me, the current situation is where I feel there is a domestic crisis in Chinese politics. Why? Because Xi Jinping does not have the full support of the PLA. Why? Because he does not have a background of having served in the PLA. Second, he has appropriated all positions in the party. Apart from being the president of the People's Republic of China, he is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, chairman of the Central Military Commission. You name it, he's the head of everything. Within the party, there are murmurs that he's the second Mao. He was upset, Xi Jinping, because to him, Mao is a footnote. And he is an individual who has decided that he has to leave an imprint in Chinese history. Another question, why? Because next year, July 23, will mark 100 years of the Communist Party of China, and he'll be at the helm. He has to show his people he has done something. Is that something this limited attrition taking place in this river valley called Galvan. My first digression, I am fascinated by names and titles, and Galvan River Valley, actually, there's a Kashmiri word which comes from Galwan. Galwan in Kashmiri means somebody who's been maintaining horses. In the past, the person or people who used to live in this particular tract used to maintain horses, which meant there were pastures there. And when the king of Kashmir was upset with the behavior of one of these horse keepers, that person was left without horses. So he took to brigandry, and hence Galwan became Galwan, which in Kashmiri means robber. So that is the name of the river. So we could call it Robber River or whatever. Now my digression is over here. Now when this episode happened, the preparations had been taking place. The media reports here say since September last year. But to me, the reports I get independently from within the system and also out of it are that these digressions, or rather transgressions, as the host Yasin had said, they have been taking place for quite some time. These transgressions have been happening ever since the war happened in 1962. It's just that we have never reacted, and China has been encroaching on what we call is our land, and it is our land. Why? What we are missing is that Western Ladakh is a repository of rare earths and metals, which our Geological Survey of India has never prospected for. But reports from people living there very close to Aksai Chin have said that for a couple of years, Chinese, you could say, technical assistants, scientific technical assistants, they used to come and then take samples of the hot springs and then go. Then they had Chinese tourists in double coats turning up in buses, taking selfies, taking large flasks of hot springs, and also followed by earth movers who were basically excavating. To me, it reveals that they have a road network which can carry more than 25 tons over bridges. Unlike the Bailey Bridge that we had, which collapsed when a truck which was carrying 25 tons collapsed into a river, when the Bailey Bridge could only take up to 15 tons, which meant that their logistics have always been, you could say, improved and improvised. Strategically, it means that this Galvan Valley river is very important to the Chinese because it seems there are angles from Galvan Valley, the higher parts, from where we could look into Xinjiang. And if a conflict arises, we could interdict the Karakoram Pass or the access roads to Karakoram Pass. But I doubt whether Indian foreign policy or strategic policy is that adventurous to take liberties at such high altitudes. Now, what flummoxes me is that India and China, will our relations improve? I do not think so, because they had never improved since the war in 1962. We have a national catharsis regarding 1962, which has held our policy hostage to 1962, period. We have still not released the report, Henderson Brooks committee report, although there is a different party in power. Now, the question is, why are we playing so squeamish about what happened? I teach in university where research is done on various aspects of China and on China. But surprisingly, I have not come across a single research proposal that examines the boundary dispute between China and India. And yes, thesis requires empirical evidence. But to get empirical evidence, research scholars have to be allowed into the border regions. But getting a permission is next to impossible. Also, China and India, China sees India not as a troublemaker, but as an irritant. Why? Because they are a one-party system where the party controls everything, and the party is also an economic entrepreneur. India to them is a large country with a large population, and where the standard of living is not to be compared with China. China still claims it is a developing country, but those who have been to China will get this feeling, rightly so, that this is a highly developed country. In India, it is in patches. To China, India is a big question mark. So is China to us, most Indians, because our ideas and impressions of China are to do with what happened in 1962. Now, I guess it is time we moved on from 1962 and address issues of today, and address issues in such a way that there is a cross-party agreement that when it comes to China, there is only one view, not several views. As we see, there are views which are expressed on Twitter, views on Instagram, views on Facebook and WhatsApp, and YouTube, of course. Now, this reveals to the Chinese a country which is very confused, because we actually are confused for very many reasons. If you look at our foreign policy, look at our relations with all our neighbors: Pakistan, China, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. With all these countries, our relations are, to say the least, not very good. With Sri Lanka, yes, but we've been sitting for 3 months to give Sri Lanka $500 million, which they'd asked for because they're facing a huge financial crisis. With Bangladesh, we have issues. With Myanmar also, although with Myanmar, some progress has taken place. With China and Pakistan, needless to say, the complications are getting more and more, which is where Galvan Valley comes in, because somewhere people have impressed upon the leadership in China that there is a link between the Galvan Valley and linking up the infrastructure there, especially roads, so that they could isolate India's highly trained troops, high altitude troops who are based in Siachen Glacier. So they could cut us from Siachen Glacier. Yes, Yasin.
Professor, I want to stop you here, and thank you for rightly putting out the history and how the domestic dynamics and domestic elements which are factoring in China's foreign policy. But here in this context, at the last part of your address, you mentioned about scholarship and how the other neighborhood policy of India. So in this context, there is one what if study by what if article written by Jevin Jacob. He also rightly mentioned that the desire to keep decision making on China within the strict confines of the government has much to do with the run-up to the 1962 Sino-Indian conflict. And in this context, there's also Harvard University professor Arunabha Ghosh. He also talks about the poor state of China's scholarship in India, and the securitization of the subject after the 1962 war. And anyway, again, Professor Tansen Sen of New York University, Shanghai, he also mentioned about the people-to-people contact. So in this context, you also mentioned that that in China, that's like one party system. So how do they take other stakeholders into the policy making decision? So if you can please have a comparative view on that, it will be great.
I will agree with you, Yasin. To put it politely and also bluntly, our policy with China is just state oriented. What the state says is the policy. No counter views are entertained or accepted. Let me begin with think tanks. Most think tanks are run by gentlemen who have maybe served in China as diplomats, or people who have connections with China in other ways, maybe business related. And research scholars are missing. Now, this is a very important aspect where our foreign policy decision making suffers. In countries with a lively functioning foreign policy system, scholars are approached regularly by practitioners of foreign policy for their insights regarding developments, positive or negative. And they are also asked to brief the subcommittees who then brief Parliament. In some rare cases, they're also asked to give in-camera briefings to Parliament subcommittees, or maybe even in Parliament, that is in countries where democracy has been the methodology of politics. We are the world's largest democracy, but I feel that our policymaking structures are pretty stunted, where change is not welcome, and change is considered to be very revolutionary. Here, students from Ladakh, the university where I teach, whom I met, they said when it comes to infrastructure, we are somewhere far behind. In the city of Leh, they have telecom infrastructure. But beyond that, once they go into the higher mountains, there's nothing. The roads are, you could technically say, not roads. And also there is no mobile connectivity, while in a village very close to Aksai where a student comes from, and the student was telling me that they have access to mobile signals, but which are China mobile. Now, the Chinese have that kind of infrastructure. Why have we failed? Was it, I hope it was not deliberate. And also, different ministries. For instance, when it comes to our border, we, along with Japan, are the only democracy, and actually, rather, most important countries in the earth, who have outstanding boundary disputes with all their neighbors. In Japan's case, it is, you could say, maritime. In India's case, it was maritime and also territorial. The maritime disputes with Sri Lanka has been ironed out. But territorially, we do not have a firm boundary with any of our neighbors, which is why we have these terminologies: LAC, line of actual control; LOC, line of control; IB, international border. Now, when will this end? And also ministerial tussles, where the line of actual control in this particular phase, till the army moved in, it was patrolled by the ITBP, Indo-Tibetan Border Police, who actually report to the Home Ministry. Now, the army has now taken over, and hence the Chinese were reacting to this aspect because they were familiar with the ITBP, who in any case were not as well equipped as the army is. Then comes the Tibet aspect. We should not forget the Tibet role also in this aspect, because if you've noticed, when it came to the loss of lives, our men in uniform who died, the people who are most quiet in the country were the Tibetans. And they have been refugees in our country for decades. And they have not made any statement, either criticizing or supporting the Indian government, except for one or two personalities in the Tibetan framework who are based in India. One is a poet, and I will not name him, but he's been openly supportive of what the Indian government is doing. But the others, the Tibetan government in exile, has been very quiet. So this Galwan Valley episode is also a message to the Tibetans that, as Xi Jinping has said last year, the next Dalai Lama will be decided by Beijing, which meant that the Communist Party of China will decide who will be the next Dalai Lama, because the current Dalai Lama is 85 years old. He is in reasonably good health, but who after him? Mainland China will decide.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And
Yes.
also on this Tibet issue, of course, Tibet is also very crucial factor in India-China border issue. And these days, I see the state head of the Tibetan government in exile, Lobsang Sangye, he is also getting some space in Indian media. Well, so I'll quickly move to the question section because we are running out of time, and then there are several questions I can see. But I'm going to ask you, I think, 3-4 questions. So first question posed by Mr. Baban Das, Assistant Professor of Chinese at NDA, India. His question is, does scrapping of Article 35A and 370 have any direct or indirect connection with the recent India-China border conflict in Galwan Valley? And also, and from my side, to supplement his question, yesterday, I guess, the foreign policy phase of BJP government, Ram Madhav also mentioned about Aksai Chin, that's part and parcel of India. So how would you like to address it, sir?
Yes, Article 35A and Article 370 have played a role for the simple reason that it makes the Ladakh region a contested sphere to the Chinese once again. Article 35A also removes the domicile status of those who have been in Kashmir, and also it opens the domicile status for those who have not been residents there. And I think just today or yesterday it had come in the newspapers of a civil servant who got domicile status in Jammu. So at one level, the Chinese feel this would lead to demographic alteration taking place. Article 370, it removed the special status of J&K. And that special status, it was designed as a cushion so that whole of Jammu and Kashmir belongs to India. Although we all know that we have maps that say that J&K is India's, it is, but more than 1/3 of that Jammu and Kashmir is not with us. Aksai Chin is with China, and other part, northern part of J&K is with Pakistan, especially Gilgit and beyond. So this was a setback to China for the simple reason they felt that their strategic interests are being hemmed in by what India has done. The other aspect is Article 35A and Article 370. It was removed by the current government to make J&K effectively a part of India, a province. I suppose they are right there because the special exception or rather exemption given to J&K had to end someday. And we all know that this has been followed by repeated instances of violence within the valley. And so far, it has not affected Jammu. Once in a while, there are episodes. But the turning point may have been what happened in Pulwama, where around 40 plus of our soldiers lost their lives. I think they were the CRPF, nevertheless, men in uniform. Now, these are aspects which have, you could say, premeditated the decision taken by the government to decide what has to be done, and also the construction of the road on the line of actual control on our side. Yes, Yasi.
Thank you, Professor. And the second question by Bidham Chandra. He is a PhD candidate at the East China Normal University, Shanghai, PRC. His question is, has India's neighborhood first policy failed? As countering China economically or militarily is a limited option. How should India utilize or capitalize the multilateral platforms?
The answer to that question will be layered. First, when it comes to, you could say, our foreign policy, I have two counter questions. One, do we have a foreign policy? Second, if we have a foreign policy, why is it that all the multilateral institutions we used to be part of are ineffective? The SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, is it functional? What about something called the Non-Aligned Movement? NAM. NAM has effectively become nameless. The CHOGM, Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. It is just a meeting where resolutions are passed but never implemented. So multilateral forums have failed. Why? Because India is still to get over the NAM, we would say the NAM psychosis, because we were part of creating NAM with Jamal Abdel Nasser and Joseph Broz Tito. Both of them, well, along with Jawaharlal Nehru, of course, no longer around. But at that time, NAM was supposed to be the counter to the Cold War. But it failed when all the countries in the NAM, they had either the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, or the United States as their primary bilateral partners in economic and strategic matters. So to me, Indian foreign policy needs a comprehensive overhaul where foreign policy cannot be seen as only term-based foreign policy. Foreign policy needs to have a compact between all the political parties as to what is long-term foreign policy, which will be there for decades. Only then can we have structures with institutions that are functioning. Otherwise, One Belt, One Road will succeed, Maritime Silk Road Initiative will succeed, and we'll be left on the sidelines. There is talk, it seems, of India aligning with the United States, taking part in various activities where the United States, Australia, United Kingdom, New Zealand, they're all, it seems, together part of a group. They call themselves the G4. And India wants to be G5, a part of the G5. But then the Cold War mentality operates in the case of the United States, where India is not a reliable commodity. To them, India is a commodity.
Okay.
So we have to place our cards very well. Yes, sorry, yes.
We are really running out of time. And then I have to take one last question. I would expect you to be very quick, not more than 40 seconds or 1 minute. So this is the question by Sushant Kumar, Mr. Sushant Kumar. He's the assistant professor at the Department of Far East Languages, Central University of Jharkhand, Ranchi. His question is, how do you see Chinese army consolidating its position in the western sector, such as building up helipads and some military structure at Finger Four in the Pangkong Tso area? And how do you view China trying to alter the status quo in the western sector? Very quickly, sir.
They've already altered the status quo, and they will keep building the infrastructure so that we end up spending more and we get into a financial morass. Yes.
Thank you,
Yasin, I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your valuable time and very insightful engagement. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Yasin. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.